when drifter Tom Garrett rode into the Sullivan Ranch in 1847 Wyoming Territory with enough gold to buy the finest horse. He never expected to find a widowed mother and her 6 children on the verge of losing everything to debt collectors and a dark secret from his outlaw past. What he discovered would force him to choose between the safety of a solitary life and the dangerous vulnerability of letting 6 strangers become the family he'd always been afraid to want. But when his former gang leader frames him for bank robbery, will Tom's newfound family stand by a man whose past could destroy them all? A gunshot cracked through the Wyoming morning air, sending ravens exploding from the pine trees like black confetti. Tom Garrett's horse danced sideways as the echo bounced off the rocky hills, but Tom's steady hands never wavered on the reins. He'd heard enough gunfire in his 32 years to know the difference between hunting and trouble, and this shot carried the sharp report of a rifle putting down a suffering animal. The autumn wind of 1847 carried stories across these territorial tales of families struggling to survive another harsh winter, of debts growing like tumbleweeds, and of men desperate enough to take what wasn't theirs. Tom touched the leather pouch hidden beneath his worn coat, feeling the weight of gold coins earned through 3 years of honest work breaking horses for cattle ranches from Colorado to Montana. Enough money to buy the finest stallion west of the Mississippi, and maybe enough left over to start something new. Ahead, smoke rose from a chimney like a gray ribbon against the blue sky. The Sweetwater Ranch spread before him in the valley below weathered buildings that had seen better days but still stood proud against the wilderness. Horses grazed in a pasture that stretched toward distant mountains, their coats gleaming like polished copper in midnight silk. Tom's practiced eye counted at least 20 head of quality stock, the kind of animals that could carry a man safely through any adventure. But something felt wrong. The main house sat too quiet for midday, and the barn doors hung open as if someone had left in a hurry. No cowboys worked the corrals, no ranch hands mended fences or tended equipment. For a spread this size to run properly, Tom figured it needed at least 4 grown men working sunrise to sunset. He guided his mare down the winding trail, noting how recent rains had washed deep gullies in the path damage that should have been repaired weeks ago. The closer he rode, the more details emerged that told a story of struggle. Fence posts leaned at odd angles, held up more by habit than strength. The vegetable garden beside the house showed signs of careful tending, but the tool shed roof sagged under missing shingles. Tom dismounted near the front porch, his boots hitting packed earth that hadn't seen rain in days. The house itself looked solid despite its tired appearance, 2 stories of hand-hewn logs with windows that sparkled clean in the afternoon sun. Someone took pride in this place, even if they lacked the resources to maintain it properly. Before he could knock, the front door swung open. A woman stepped onto the porch, and Tom found himself removing his hat without conscious thought. She stood medium height, with red hair pulled back in a practical bun, green eyes that missed nothing, and flour dusting the front of her blue dress. Maybe 35 years old, she carried herself with the straight-back dignity of someone who'd learned to face trouble head-on. "You'll be here about the horses," she said, her voice carrying the musical accent of Ireland. Not a questiona statement that suggested she'd been expecting him, though Tom had sent no word ahead of his arrival. "Yes, ma'am. Thomas Garrett." He gestured toward the pasture where the horses continued their peaceful grazing. "Saw your advertisement in the Cheyenne newspaper. Says you've got quality stock for sale." Something flickered across her face relief mixed with worry, like a person grateful for good news but afraid to trust it. Eleanor Sullivan. "These animals are the finest in the territory, bred by my late husband for strength and intelligence, each one trained to work cattle or carry riders across any terrain." The word late hit Tom like a physical blow. This woman stood alone on a ranch that demanded constant labor, trying to manage livestock and property that would challenge a crew of experienced men. No wonder the place showed signs of neglect. She was fighting a battle against impossible odds. Movement in the house windows caught his attention. Faces appeared and disappeared like shy deer children of various ages, watching this stranger with curious eyes. Tom counted at least 4 young ones before they ducked out of sight, probably warned by their mother to stay inside when visitors arrived. "Might I take a look at your horses, Mrs. Sullivan?" Tom asked, though he found himself more interested in the story behind those watching eyes than in purchasing livestock. Eleanor nodded toward the pasture. "Of course. Though I should warn you, Mr. Garrett, these animals aren't meant for men who use whips and spurs. My husband believed in partnership between horse and rider, not dominance." They walked toward the corral, where several horses had gathered near the fence, drawn by curiosity about the newcomers. Tom appreciated how the animals showed no fear, only alert interest in these humans who'd entered their domain, a good sign that they'd been treated with respect and kindness. "This beauty here is Copper," Eleanor said, indicating a chestnut mare whose coat gleamed like burnished metal. 6 years old, gentle enough for children but strong enough to work cattle all day. "And that black gelding is Thunderfast, as his name suggests, and smart enough to anticipate what his rider needs." Tom studied the horses with growing amazement. These weren't just good animals, they were exceptional, the kind of stock that wealthy ranchers paid premium prices to acquire. Yet here stood this woman, obviously in need of money, offering to sell her husband's life work to a stranger. "Mrs. Sullivan," Tom said carefully, "horses like these are worth considerable money, more than most folks around here could afford to pay." Her shoulders sagged slightly, and Tom glimpsed the exhaustion she'd been hiding behind her composed exterior. "I'm aware of their value, Mr. Garrett. But value means nothing if you can't find buyers willing to pay fair prices. Most men who've come calling want to purchase the entire herd for half what they're worth, knowing I have little choice but to accept." The afternoon sun slanted lower, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. In the distance, thunder rumbled, not the sound of an approaching storm, but the deep rumble that promised rain before nightfall. Tom felt something stirring in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years of solitary wandering. "How many children you raising here, ma'am?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Eleanor's eyes sharpened with the protective instinct of a mother assessing potential threat. 6, ages 6 to 16. Why do you ask?" 6 children. Tom's mind reeled at the magnitude of responsibility this woman carried alone. Food, clothing, education, medical care, protectional falling on shoulders that already bore the weight of managing a failing ranch. "Just wondering how you manage such a spread with so much responsibility," Tom said honestly. "Must take considerable strength and determination." Before Eleanor could respond, a boy emerged from the barn, tall and gangly with dark hair and serious eyes that belonged on someone much older. He carried a rifle with practiced ease, and his gaze never left Tom's face as he approached. "Ma, everything all right out here?" The boy's voice cracked slightly, betraying his youth despite his attempt at adult authority. "Everything's fine, Patrick. Mr. Garrett is here to look at the horses." Eleanor's voice carried pride and affection as she introduced her eldest son. "Patrick helps me run the ranch. Couldn't manage without him." Patrick nodded acknowledgement but kept the rifle ready, not threatening, but prepared. Tom recognized the stance of someone who'd learned to protect what mattered most, regardless of personal cost. As if summoned by their older brother's appearance, more children materialized from various parts of the ranch. A boy of perhaps 14 with ink-stained fingers, a girl of 12 with her mother's red hair, and 2 younger ones who hung back shyly near the porch steps. Each child showed signs of hard work and responsibility beyond their years, but also the bright eyes and healthy appearance of young ones who were loved and cared for. The last to appear was the Smolesta girl of maybe 6 who clutched a cornhusk doll and studied Tom with solemn green eyes that matched her mother's. She whispered something to the doll before looking up at this tall stranger who'd invaded their world. Tom felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. These weren't just people trying to sell him a horse, they were a family fighting to survive, and something about their quiet dignity and fierce loyalty to each other reminded him of dreams he'd abandoned long ago. Thunder rolled closer, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. What kind of man would Tom Garrett choose to be when faced with a family that needed more help than he'd ever planned to give? "That storm's going to be a big one," Eleanor said, glancing at the darkening sky as raindrops began pelting the dusty ground like scattered coins. "You're welcome to wait it out in the barn, Mr. Garrett, though I suspect you'll want to be moving on before nightfall." Tom heard the polite dismissal in her words, but something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way Patrick still gripped that rifle, ready to defend his family against any threat. Maybe it was how the youngest girl, Molly, he'd heard Eleanor call her, peeked at him from behind her mother's skirts with curious eyes that held no fear. Or maybe it was simply that after 3 years of sleeping under stars and eating cold beans from a can, the warm yellow light spilling from the house windows looked like something from a half-remembered dream. "Actually, ma'am, I was hoping to discuss terms for purchasing several of your horses," Tom said, surprising himself with the words. "Might take some time to work out the details properly." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "Several horses? Most buyers come looking for 1 or 2 animals at most. I represent some cattle operations up north." Tom lied smoothly, the deception coming easier than he liked. "They're expanding their herds and need quality mounts for their cowboys. Horses that can handle rough terrain and long days in the saddle." The lie felt necessary somehow. Tom had learned long ago that people treated you differently when they thought you had backing, money, and purpose beyond your own needs. A lone drifter looking to buy a single horse got one kind of treatment. A representative of multiple businesses looking to purchase valuable livestock got another entirely. "Well then," Eleanor said, though uncertainty flickered in her green eyes, "perhaps we should continue this conversation inside. No sense in all of us getting soaked." As they walked toward the house, Tom noticed more details that painted a picture of quiet desperation. The front steps, though swept clean, showed worn spots where countless feet had climbed them over the years. The porch railing had been mended in several places, with whatever wood could be found, creating a patchwork of different colors and textures that spoke of making do rather than proper repairs. But inside, the house told a different story entirely. The main room glowed with warmth and comfort that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with love. Hand-sewn quilts brightened simple furniture, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air like a promise of abundance. Books lined shelves built into one wall more books than Tom had seen outside of a town library. A piano sat in one corner, its wooden surface polished to a shine despite the obvious age of the instrument. "Children, come meet Mr. Garrett properly," Eleanor called, and Tom found himself surrounded by curious faces and eager introductions. Patrick, at 16, stood nearly as tall as Tom and possessed his mother's direct gaze, along with the broad shoulders of someone accustomed to physical labor. Michael, 14, had the ink-stained fingers of a student and the bright eyes of someone who devoured knowledge like food. Bridget, 12, shared her mother's red hair and practical manner, while 8-year-old Sean bounced with barely contained energy that suggested trouble and mischief in equal measure. Little Molly, just 6 years old, hung back initially but eventually crept closer when Tom knelt down to her level. "That's a fine doll you've got there," he said gently. "Does she have a name?" "Her name is Hope," Molly whispered, clutching the corn husk figure tighter. "Papa made her for me before he went to heaven. Mama says hope helps us remember that good things can happen even when we're sad." Tom felt something twist in his chest at the child's simple faith. When had he stopped believing that good things could happen? When had hope become something other people possessed, while he simply survived from one day to the next? "Hope's a perfect name for such a special doll," Tom said softly, and Molly rewarded him with a smile that could have powered the oil lamps for a week. Eleanor bustled around the kitchen, setting places at the large wooden table that dominated the center of the room. "You'll stay for supper, of course, Mr. Garrett." It's nothing fancy venison stew and fresh bread, but there's plenty to go around. Tom started to protest that he didn't want to impose, but Patrick spoke up from across the room. Ma always makes enough food for unexpected guests. Says you never know when someone might need a hot meal and a place to rest. As they gathered around the table, Tom noticed how each child had specific responsibilities. Michael carved the bread with careful precision. Bridget ladled stew into bowls. Sean distributed spoons and napkins. And even little Molly helped by folding cloth napkins into neat triangles. Patrick said grace in a clear, strong voice that reminded Tom of his own father's prayers from what seemed like a lifetime ago. The conversation during dinner revealed more about this remarkable family than any business discussion could have. Michael was teaching himself advanced mathematics from books his father had bought, planning to become an engineer someday. Bridget wanted to be a teacher and already helped the younger children with their letters and numbers. Sean dreamed of exploring the western mountains and finding gold or silver or maybe just adventure. Molly announced that she was going to have a horse of her own someday, a gentle mare who would carry her anywhere she wanted to go. "And what about you, Patrick?" Tom asked the eldest son. "What are your plans for the future?" Patrick glanced at his mother before answering. "My plans are to keep this ranch running and take care of my family. Everything else can wait." The weight of responsibility in those words hit Tom like a physical blow. Here was a boy who should be thinking about his own dreams and adventures, instead shouldering the burden of supporting 5 siblings and a widowed mother. The unfairness of it made Tom's jaw clench with unexpected anger. After dinner, as Eleanor tucked the younger children into bed, Tom found himself alone with Patrick on the front porch. The storm had arrived in earnest lightning, illuminated the landscape in stark black and white photographs, while thunder shook the house windows. Rain pounded the roof with the force of nature unleashed. "How long since your father passed?" Tom asked quietly. 6 months, Patrick replied. "Fever came sudden and took him in less than a week. One day, he was working the horses, planning improvements to the ranch. Next thing we knew, he was gone." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage across the territory. Finally, Patrick spoke again. "Mr. Garrett, can I ask you something straight?" "Shoot." "Are you really here representing cattle operations up north? Or are you just another man looking to take advantage of a widow with too many children and not enough options?" Tom studied the boy's serious face in the dim light from the window. Patrick deserved honesty, even if the truth was more complicated than Tom fully understood himself. "I came here to buy a horse," Tom said slowly. "One horse, for myself. The story about representing other businesses, that was a lie, and I apologize for telling it." Patrick's hand moved closer to the rifle leaning against the porch railing, but his voice remained steady. "Then why are you still here? And why did you tell Ma you wanted to buy several horses?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, trying to find words for feelings he didn't fully comprehend himself. Sometimes, a man sets out looking for one thing and discovers he needs something entirely different. I've been wandering these territories for 3 years, working ranches, sleeping under stars, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. Your family, this place, it reminds me of something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? The possibility that belonging somewhere doesn't make you weak, that caring about people doesn't automatically lead to heartbreak. Patrick considered this carefully. "Ma's been hurt enough, Mr. Garrett. We all have. If you're planning to disappear come morning, it might be better to do it now before the little ones get too attached." Before Tom could respond, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her hair loose around her shoulders and her face soft with maternal exhaustion. "Patrick, you should get some sleep," she said gently. "Morning comes early, and we've got that fence in the north pasture to repair." Patrick stood but hesitated before going inside. "Mr. Garrett, whatever you decide, I want you to know this family doesn't need rescuing. We need partnership. There's a difference." As the boy disappeared into the house, Eleanor settled into the chair he'd vacated. The storm continued its assault on the landscape, but the porch felt sheltered and peaceful. "He's wise beyond his years," Tom observed. "He's had to be," Eleanor replied. "They all have. But I worry sometimes that they're growing up too fast, taking on burdens that should belong to adults." Tom thought about the gold in his saddlebags, enough money to make a real difference in this family's circumstances, but also his entire life savings. Money he'd planned to use for his own fresh start somewhere, far from his past mistakes and regrets. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said carefully, "what would it take to save this ranch? To give your family the security they deserve?" Eleanor was quiet for so long that Tom wondered if she'd heard the question. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd calculated impossible numbers too many times. "More than we have," she said simply. "More than most people would be willing to invest in a widow with 6 children and a ranch that needs considerable repairs." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the landscape in brilliant detail before plunging it back into darkness. In that brief moment of clarity, Tom made a decision that would change everything. But as he opened his mouth to speak, the sound of approaching horses cut through the storm riders, moving fast through the rain, their urgency suggesting news that couldn't wait for morning. What kind of trouble was racing toward the Sullivan Ranch through the darkness, and would Tom's newfound determination to help this family survive long enough to matter? Rain started falling just as Mrs. Henley's fancy black carriage disappeared down the muddy road. Tom watched the water drip from the barn roof, each drop making a tiny splash in the growing puddles. His heart was beating fast, like a rabbit running from a wolf. What had he just done? He'd told a big lie about buying lots of horses, and now this family was looking at him like he might be their hero. Eleanor Sullivan stood in the doorway, her green eyes studying his face. She didn't say anything, but Tom could tell she was thinking hard. Behind her, 6 pairs of eyes watched him from the porch. The oldest boy, Patrick, had his arms crossed like he didn't trust anyone anymore. The youngest girl, Molly, was hiding behind her mother's skirt, peeking out with curious eyes. "Why did you do that?" Eleanor asked quietly. Her voice was soft, but Tom heard something else in it. Hope, maybe, or fear that the hope might get crushed. Tom pulled his hat off and ran his fingers through his dark hair. "I don't rightly know, ma'am. Just seemed like the right thing to do." He looked at the children again. The middle boy, Michael, was holding a pencil and some papers, probably schoolwork. The girls, Bridget and little Molly, stood close together like they always took care of each other. Patrick stepped forward, his boots making loud sounds on the wooden porch. "Mister, we don't need charity. We can take care of ourselves." His voice cracked a little, the way boys' voices do when they're trying to sound like men. "I'm sure you can," Tom said, meaning it. "But sometimes taking care of yourself means letting others help when they want to." Eleanor walked closer, and Tom caught the smell of fresh bread and soap. It reminded him of something from long ago, maybe his mother's kitchen before the fever took his parents. "Mr. Garrett, I need to ask you something straight. Do you really want to buy our horses, or are you just being kind?" The question hit Tom like a punch to the stomach. He'd been asking himself the same thing. "I came here to buy 1 horse," he said slowly. "But seeing your family, seeing what you're trying to build here, maybe I want to buy more than that." "What do you mean?" Bridget asked. She looked about 12, with red hair like her mother and freckles across her nose. Tom looked around the ranch. The fences needed fixing. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges. But the horses were beautiful, and the house, though small, felt warm even in the cold rain. "I mean, maybe I want to buy a chance to help. Maybe I want to buy a place to stay for a while." Sean, the 8-year-old boy, tugged on his mother's dress. "Ma, can he stay? He looks nice." His voice was whisper, quiet, like he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. Eleanor knelt down to Sean's level. "What do you think, sweetheart? Should we trust Mr. Garrett?" Tom's throat felt tight. When was the last time anyone had asked a child what they thought about him? When was the last time anyone had asked at all? "He has kind eyes," Sean said, looking right at Tom. like Papa did. The words hit Tom harder than any storm. He turned away for a moment, pretending to watch the rain. But really, he was trying not to let these people see how much their simple trust meant to him. "The bank wants $300, Eleanor said suddenly. "Mrs. Henley said we have 2 weeks to pay it, or they'll take the ranch." Her voice was steady, but Tom saw her hands shaking just a little. $300. Tom had more than that in his saddlebags, saved from years of working cattle drives and odd jobs, but giving it to them wouldn't solve everything. It might not even be enough to save the ranch for good. "How much could you get for the horses?" Tom asked. Patrick spoke up again, his young voice full of anger. "Not enough. We've tried selling them for months. People want to pay half what they're worth, knowing we're desperate." Tom nodded. He'd seen it before. Folks who smelled desperation took advantage of it. What if we had time to find the right buyers? People who'd pay fair prices? "We don't have time," Eleanor said. 2 weeks isn't enough to— "It might be," Tom interrupted gently, "if we work together. If we make this place look prosperous instead of desperate. If we show people you're not selling because you have to, but because you're choosy about who gets your fine animals." Michael looked up from his papers. "That's really smart, Mr. Garrett. Like the stories where people pretend to be rich so they can actually become rich." Tom grinned at the boy. "Exactly like that. But it means we'd have to work hard, all of us. And it means trusting each other." The rain was coming down harder now, drumming on the roof like tiny hammers. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by the low rumble of thunder. Tom watched the family look at each other, having one of those silent conversations that families have. Finally, Eleanor stood up straight, decision made. "Mr. Garrett, if you're willing to help us, we're willing to trust you. But I need to know something first." "What's that?" "Why? Why would a stranger want to help a family he just met?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain and thinking about the question. How could he explain that he'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere? How could he tell them that watching them stand together against their troubles made him remember what he'd been missing? "Maybe," he said finally, "because I've been looking for something my whole life, and I think I might have just found it." Thunder crashed overhead, closer this time, and as the Sullivan family welcomed him into their house to wait out the storm, Tom Garrett realized that some searches end exactly where they're supposed to begin. The storm hit with the fury of a wild animal, rattling the windows and sending the horses dancing nervously in their stalls. Tom found himself sitting at the kitchen table with 6 children and their mother, sharing a simple dinner of stew and cornbread, while the wind howled outside like a living thing. "Tell us about yourself, Mr. Garrett," Eleanor said, ladling another spoonful of stew into his bowl. "Where do you come from?" Tom chewed slowly, thinking about how to answer. These people had been honest with him about their troubles. Maybe it was time to be honest back. "I grew up in Kansas," he said. "Lost my folks when I was about Patrick's age. Been moving around ever since, working ranches, driving cattle." "Don't you have any family?" Molly asked, her blue eyes wide with curiosity. "Not anymore, little one. Just me." Bridget set down her spoon with a thoughtful expression. "That must be lonely." "It is," Tom admitted. "More lonely than I let myself think about most times." Patrick leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Ma says being alone is different from being lonely. She says you can be alone and still be happy if you're doing something that matters." Smart boy, Tom thought. Your mother's right. But doing something that matters is easier when you have people who matter to you. Michael suddenly jumped up from the table. "I almost forgot. I finished my arithmetic homework. Want to see, Mr. Garrett?" He ran to get his slate, nearly tripping over the family's old dog in his excitement. "Michael's the smartest one in his class," Sean said proudly. "Teacher says he might be able to go to a real school in Cheyenne someday." "If we can afford it," Eleanor added quietly. Tom studied the boy's careful numbers and neat handwriting. "This is fine work, Michael. You've got a good head for figures." The boy beamed with pride. "I want to be a banker someday, or maybe a newspaper man. I like writing stories too." Nothing wrong with dreaming big, Tom said. Smart fellow like you could do whatever he sets his mind to. Outside, the storm was getting worse. Lightning flashed so bright it lit up the whole kitchen, followed immediately by thunder that shook the house. Molly squeaked and scooted her chair closer to Tom's. It's all right, sweetheart, Eleanor said. It's just noise. But then they heard a different sound, a loud crack, followed by a tremendous crash that seemed to come from right outside. Patrick jumped up and ran to the window. The big oak tree! It fell right across the road. Tom stood up quickly, his mind already working. A tree across the road meant no one could get in or out. If there was an emergency, if Mrs. Henley decided to come back with more pressure, if anyone needed help. We'll have to clear it, he said. In this storm? Eleanor looked worried. Tom, it's dangerous out there. Another flash of lightning showed them the size of the problem. The oak tree was massive, its thick trunk completely blocking the narrow road that led to the ranch. It would take hours to cut it up and move it, even with several people working. We can't wait for the storm to pass, Tom said. If that tree stays there, we're trapped. And if we're trapped, he didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. Being trapped meant being helpless if trouble came calling. I'll help, Patrick said immediately. Me too, Michael added, though he looked scared. Boys, you're not going out in this weather, Eleanor said firmly. Ma, we're not babies, Patrick argued. If Mr. Garrett says we need to clear the tree, then we need to clear it. Tom looked at the family gathered around the table. These children had already lost their father. He couldn't let them risk their lives in a dangerous storm. But he also couldn't ignore the determined look in Patrick's eyes, or the way Michael was straightening his shoulders like he was ready to prove himself. Here's what we'll do, Tom said. Patrick and I will go out first, see how bad it really is. If it's too dangerous, we come right back. If we think we can manage it safely, Michael can join us, but the younger ones stay inside with their mother. Sean's face fell. I want to help too. You are helping, Tom told him. You're helping by staying safe and taking care of your sisters. That's just as important as any other job. Eleanor brought them oilskin coats and hats. Be careful, she said, her voice tight with worry. I can't lose anyone else. Tom paused in putting on his coat. The simple words carried the weight of a mother's worst fears. We'll be careful, he promised, and we'll be back. Outside, the storm was even worse than it had sounded from inside the house. Rain hit them like bullets, and the wind was so strong it nearly knocked Patrick off his feet. But the boy stayed right beside Tom as they made their way to where the great oak had fallen. The tree was even bigger than it had looked from the window. Its massive trunk, wider than a man could wrap his arms around, lay directly across the road. Branches spread in every direction, some as thick as regular trees themselves. How are we going to move this? Patrick shouted over the wind. Tom studied the situation, water streaming from his hat brim. We can't move it. We have to cut it up into pieces small enough to drag off the road. They fetched axes and a long saw from the barn. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. Every few minutes, lightning would flash, forcing them to stop swinging their tools until the thunder passed. The rain made everything slippery, and the wind kept trying to tear the tools from their hands. But slowly, piece by piece, they began to make progress. Patrick worked with the determination of someone twice his age, never complaining even when Tom could see he was exhausted. Michael joined them after the first hour, and though he was smaller and younger, he worked just as hard. The three of them developed a rhythm. Tom and Patrick would cut. Michael would help drag the pieces off to the side of the road. You boys are tougher than rawhide, Tom called out during a brief lull in the storm. Pa used to say, hard work never killed anyone, Patrick replied, wiping rain from his eyes. Ma says he was wrong about that, but I think he meant it builds character. Tom grinned despite his exhaustion. Your pa was a wise man. As they worked, Tom found himself thinking about what Patrick had said earlier, being alone versus being lonely. For years, Tom had told himself he preferred being alone. No one to worry about, no one to disappoint, no one to lose. But working beside these boys, feeling like part of something bigger than himself, he realized he'd been lying to himself all along. By the time they cleared enough of the tree to make the road passable again, all three of them were soaked to the skin and shaking with cold. But as they trudged back to the house, Tom felt something warm growing in his chest that had nothing to do with the promise of dry clothes and hot coffee. Eleanor met them at the door with towels and worried questions. The girls gathered around, chattering excitedly about how brave their brothers had been. And as Tom sat by the fire, watching this family fuss over each other with love and care, he realized something that scared him more than any storm. He didn't want to leave. Not tomorrow, not next week, not ever. And that was the most dangerous feeling a drifter could have. 3 horses thundered toward the ranch at sunrise, their riders wearing silver badges that caught the morning light like warning signals. Tom's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips as he spotted them through the kitchen window. The lead rider sat tall in his saddle, his face hard as winter stone. "Eleanor," Tom whispered, setting down his cup with shaking hands. "Get the children inside. Now." But it was too late. The riders had already reached the front yard, their horses snorting and pawing the ground. The lead man climbed down slowly, his spurs jingling with each step. Behind him, 2 deputies flanked the porch, their hands resting on their gun belts. "We're looking for Thomas Garrett," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying across the yard like a death sentence. Tom stepped onto the porch, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone could hear it. Behind him, he felt Eleanor's presence, solid and warm. The children gathered at the windows, their faces pressed against the glass like flowers seeking sunlight. "That would be me," Tom said, raising his hands where everyone could see them. "What seems to be the trouble, Sheriff?" The lawman's eyes were cold as January ice. "Name's Morrison. I've got a warrant for your arrest. You're wanted for bank robbery in Denver City." The words hit Tom like a punch to the stomach. Denver City, where Jake Tolliver and his gang had struck just last month. Tom's mouth went dry as dust. "Sheriff, there's been a mistake," Eleanor said, stepping forward. Her voice stayed calm, but Tom could see her hands trembling. "Mr. Garrett has been here for over a week, helping us with ranch work." Morrison pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Got a witness says different, ma'am. Says Tom Garrett rode with Jake Tolliver's gang when they hit the First National Bank." Tom felt his world crashing down around him like a house in a tornado. Jake Tolliver. The name brought back memories he'd tried to bury deep. 5 years ago, he'd ridden with Jake's gang for 2 terrible years, but he'd never robbed banks, never hurt innocent people. "I haven't seen Jake Tolliver in 5 years, Tom said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Haven't broken any laws since I've been in Wyoming." Deputy Wilson, a young man with nervous eyes, stepped forward. "The witness was real sure, Garrett. Said you were there when they took $3,000. $3,000. More money than most folks saw in a lifetime." Tom's mind raced, trying to understand how this nightmare had found him here, in the one place he'd started to feel safe. Patrick appeared in the doorway, his teenage face twisted with anger. "This is crazy. Tom wouldn't hurt a fly. He's been teaching me to gentle horses without breaking their spirit." "Son, you need to step back," Morrison said, not unkindly. "This is grown-up business." But little Molly pushed past her older brother, clutching her rag doll tight against her chest. "Tom reads me stories every night," she said, her voice small but fierce. "Bad men don't read stories to little girls." Tom's heart broke as he looked at this child, who'd claimed him as family. Just a week ago, he'd been a stranger looking to buy a horse. Now 6 children and their mother were ready to fight for him. "I appreciate what you folks are saying," Morrison continued, "but I've got my orders. Jake Tolliver's gang has been terrorizing banks across 3 territories. The law doesn't take kindly to bank robbers." Eleanor stepped closer to Tom, her chin raised like a warrior ready for battle. "If you're arresting him, Sheriff, you better have solid proof." This man has shown nothing but kindness to my family. Morrison's expression softened slightly. Ma'am, I understand your feelings, but do you? Eleanor's Irish accent grew stronger with her anger. Do you understand what it's like to watch good men get blamed for other people's crimes? To see justice twisted by lies and fear? Tom watched this brave woman defend him, and something deep inside his chest felt like it might explode. No one had ever stood up for him before. Not since his parents died when he was 16, and the world became a cold, lonely place. Eleanor, it's all right, Tom said quietly. I'll go with them. This will get sorted out. No, it won't, she shot back, her green eyes blazing. I know what happens to men like you in situations like this. Good men get railroaded while the real criminals stay free. Morrison pulled out iron handcuffs that glinted in the morning sun. I'm sorry, ma'am, but Mr. Garrett needs to come with us. He'll get a fair trial in Cheyenne. As the cold metal clicked around Tom's wrists, he looked back at the family that had become his whole world in just 7 days. Michael stood holding his schoolbooks, his ink-stained fingers clenched into fists. Bridget had her arm around Sean, both of them fighting back tears. Patrick looked ready to start a war. And Eleanor looked at him with eyes full of something Tom had never seen directed at him before. Complete faith, total belief in his innocence. This isn't over, Thomas Garrett, she called as Morrison helped him onto a horse. Not by a long shot. As they rode away from the ranch, Tom twisted in his saddle for one last look. The Sullivan family stood together on the porch like a fortress of love and loyalty. 6 children and their mother, united against injustice. Behind them, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and threatening. But for the first time in his life, Tom realized that storms could be weathered when you had people worth fighting for. The question was, would they fight for him, or would common sense tell them to let a drifter's problems ride away with him? He was about to find out just how deep family loyalty could run when everything was on the line. Eleanor Sullivan had buried one good man already. She wasn't about to lose another without a fight that would shake the very foundations of Wyoming Territory. Patrick, hitch the wagon, she said, her voice sharp as a cavalry saber. Michael, gather every paper Tom touched while he was here. Receipts, work records, anything that proves he was helping us this past week. The older children sprang into action like soldiers, following their general's orders. But 8-year-old Sean tugged at his mother's skirt, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Mama, why did those men take Tom away? He didn't do anything bad. Eleanor knelt down and took her son's face in her hands. Sometimes, sweetheart, the world makes mistakes about good people, but our family doesn't abandon folks we care about. We fight for them. Even when it's scary? Molly asked, still clutching her doll. Especially when it's scary, Eleanor replied, standing and smoothing her black dress. Your papa always said that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when your knees are shaking. Bridget, wise beyond her 12 years, was already packing food and blankets. How far is Cheyenne, Mama? 2 days hard riding. 3 if we stop for proper rest. Eleanor's mind raced through everything they'd need for the journey. Money for a hotel room, food for 6 growing children, and somehow enough left over to hire a lawyer if needed. Patrick appeared in the doorway, mud still caked on his boots from hitching the horses. Wagon's ready, Ma. But I've been thinking, what if those lawmen were right? What if Tom really did? Patrick Sullivan. Eleanor's voice could have frozen fire. You've spent every day this week working alongside that man. You've seen how he treats your little sister, how he helped your brother with his reading. Do you really think someone capable of that kind of gentleness could rob banks and hurt innocent people? Patrick's face flushed red. No, ma'am, I don't. I just thought maybe we should be prepared for... We're prepared for the truth, Eleanor said firmly. And the truth is that Tom Garrett is as honest as the day is long. Michael looked up from the papers he'd been organizing. Mama, I found something strange. Tom paid Mr. Henderson at the general store with gold coins, but they're old, really old. If he just robbed a bank, wouldn't he have new paper money? Eleanor felt a surge of hope. Her second son had always been sharp with details. That's good thinking, Michael. What else did you notice? Well, he's got calluses on his hands from ranch work, but no rope burns on his wrists. And his horse. She's been well cared for, but she's not built for speed. Bank robbers need fast horses for getaways. Bridget nodded thoughtfully. And he sleeps light, like someone used to being alone. But he's not jumpy around loud noises like men who've been in gunfights. Eleanor looked at her children with pride swelling in her chest. They were thinking like detectives, gathering evidence to save the man who'd become part of their family. The wagon ride to Cheyenne felt like the longest journey of Eleanor's life. The children took turns walking to rest the horses, and they stopped only when absolutely necessary. As they traveled, stories about Tom poured out of them like water from a broken dam. "Remember how he fixed the roof without being asked?" Sean said. "And how he taught me to whistle like a meadowlark," Molly added. "He never once raised his voice, even when I accidentally let the chickens loose," Bridget recalled. Each memory was like a piece of armor, protection against the doubt that tried to creep into Eleanor's heart during the long, dark hours of travel. On the second day, they met other travelers on the road. Word about the bank robber's arrest had spread fast, and opinions were mixed. "Heard they caught one of Jake Tolliver's boys," said a merchant heading toward Laramie. "About time someone paid for all those robberies." But an old trapper disagreed. "Jake Tolliver works alone mostly. Don't trust nobody enough to share his take. Something ain't right about this arrest." When they finally reached Cheyenne, the town buzzed with excitement about the upcoming trial. Eleanor had never seen so many people in one place. The streets teemed with cowboys, merchants, families, and curiosity seekers drawn by the drama. At the hotel, the desk clerk looked skeptical when Eleanor requested 2 rooms for herself and 6 children. "You sure you can pay for all that, ma'am?" Eleanor placed 3 gold coins on the counter, money from the emergency fund she'd kept hidden since her husband's death. "I'm sure." That evening, as the children settled into their beds, Eleanor sat by the window looking out at the courthouse where Tom's fate would be decided. Somewhere in that building, he was probably sitting in a cold cell, wondering if anyone cared enough to fight for him. "Mama?" Patrick appeared beside her, his voice quiet. "What if we can't prove Tom's innocent? What if the jury believes that witness?" Eleanor reached for her eldest son's hand. "Then we'll face that together, as a family. But Patrick, I need you to understand something. Fighting for what's right isn't about winning or losing. It's about standing up when someone needs you to stand, even if it costs us everything." Eleanor thought about the ranch they'd left behind, the animals that needed tending, the mortgage payment that would come due whether they were there or not. She thought about the risks they were taking by coming here, by making themselves visible to lawyers and judges and townspeople who might decide a widow with 6 children had no business defending an accused bank robber. "Your father used to say that everything worth having comes with a price," she said finally. "The question isn't whether we can afford to fight for Tom. The question is whether we can afford not to." In the distance, a church bell chimed midnight, marking the start of what could be the most important day in Tom Garrett's life. Eleanor closed her eyes and prayed for strength, for wisdom, and for the chance to show the world that families weren't just about blood connections. Sometimes, they were about choosing to love someone enough to risk everything for their freedom. The courthouse doors slammed open with a bang that made everyone jump. Eleanor Sullivan marched in with her 6 children following behind her like baby ducks. She wore her best black dress, the one she saved for church, but her eyes blazed with fire that could melt steel. "Your Honor," Eleanor called out in her Irish accent, "I need to speak about Thomas Garrett." The judge looked surprised. His big gray eyebrows went up high on his forehead. "Ma'am, this isn't how we do things in court." "Maybe that's the problem," Eleanor shot back. Her voice carried across the packed room like a bell ringing. People in the gallery turned to stare. Some whispered to each other behind their hands. Tom sat at the front table in heavy chains. His heart jumped when he saw Eleanor and the children. Patrick stood tall beside his mother, looking more like a man than a boy. Little Molly clutched her rag doll tight against her chest. Her lower lip trembled, but she didn't cry. The prosecutor, a thin man with a sharp nose, stood up fast. "Judge Hawthorne, this woman has no business here. We're trying a dangerous criminal." Eleanor's chin went up like she was ready to fight a bear. "The only dangerous thing here is letting an innocent man get blamed for something he didn't do." Judge Hawthorne banged his wooden hammer. "Order. Mrs. Sullivan, you may speak, but make it quick." Eleanor walked to the middle of the room. Her shoes clicked on the wooden floor. Everyone got quiet. Even the babies in the back stopped fussing. "7 days ago, Thomas Garrett came to buy a horse," Eleanor began. Her voice was strong and clear. "Instead, he found a family about to lose everything. He could have ridden away. Most men would have." She pointed toward Tom. "This man fixed our broken fence in the rain. He helped my children with their schoolwork every night. When my youngest daughter had bad dreams, he sat by her bed and told her stories until she fell asleep." Michael stood up in his seat. The 12-year-old boy held up a thick notebook. "I wrote down everything Mr. Garrett did while he stayed with us. Every day. Every hour. Look." He opened the book and began reading. Monday, Mr. Garrett helped repair the barn door. He bought nails with his own money. Tuesday, he taught Patrick how to gentle wild horses without hurting them. Wednesday, he rode to town and brought back medicine when Sean got sick. The prosecutor tried to interrupt. "Your Honor, this is just—" "Let the boy finish," Judge Hawthorne said firmly. Michael continued reading dates and times. Each entry showed Tom doing good things for the family, helping with chores, buying food, teaching the children. The list went on and on. Bridget, who was 10, stood up next. "Mr. Garrett taught me how to read big words. He said smart girls grow up to be strong women." 8-year-old Sean jumped up too. "He helped me catch fireflies, and he said my drawings were good enough to hang in a museum." Little Molly couldn't stay quiet anymore. She ran to the front of the courtroom. Her small voice carried to every corner. "Tom tells the best stories. He said the princess didn't need saving because she was brave enough to save herself." The courtroom started buzzing like a beehive. People were nodding and talking to each other. Some of the women in the gallery had tears in their eyes. Patrick walked forward with careful steps. He looked older than his 16 years. "Your Honor, my father died 6 months ago. I've been trying to be the man of the house. But Tom showed me what a real man looks like. He never raised his voice to us, never took anything that wasn't his. A bank robber doesn't waste time teaching kids how to read." The prosecutor's face turned red. "This is all very touching, but it doesn't prove anything. Criminals lie all the time. They pretend to be good people." Eleanor's eyes flashed with anger. "Are you calling my children liars?" You're saying that 6 children and their mother are all wrong about a man who lived under our roof for a week?" Eleanor's voice got louder. "That we can't tell the difference between a good man and a bad one?" Mrs. Henley, the bank woman, spoke up from the back. "I saw Mr. Garrett at the Sullivan ranch myself. He was working on their fence. His hands were dirty from honest work." More people started talking. The blacksmith said he sold Tom horseshoes. The general store owner said Tom bought flour and sugar, paying with honest money. Person after person stood up to say they had seen Tom doing normal, helpful things. Judge Hawthorne banged his hammer again. "Mr. Prosecutor, do you have any real proof that Mr. Garrett was in Denver when this robbery happened?" The thin man shuffled his papers. "We have a witness who says—" "One witness," the judge interrupted, "against a whole town of people who say he was here." Tom felt hope growing in his chest like a warm sunrise, but he was scared to believe it. He had learned not to trust good things too much. Suddenly, the courtroom doors opened again. This time, a U.S. Marshal walked in. Behind him came a man in chains who made Tom's blood turn cold. Jake Tolliver. Tom hadn't seen his old gang leader in 5 years. Jake looked older, thinner, with mean lines around his eyes. But he still had that dangerous smile that had gotten them all into trouble. "Sorry to interrupt, Your Honor," the marshal said, "but this man says he has something important to tell you about Thomas Garrett." Eleanor grabbed Patrick's hand. The children moved closer together like sheep when they smell a wolf. Tom's heart pounded so hard, he thought everyone could hear it. Jake looked around the courtroom with his cold eyes. When he saw the Sullivan family, something strange happened. His mean smile disappeared. He stared at little Molly holding her doll, at Sean hiding behind his mother's skirt, at the whole family standing together like a wall of protection around Tom. "Well?" Judge Hawthorne demanded. "What do you have to say?" Jake opened his mouth to speak. The whole courtroom held its breath. Whatever he said next would decide if Tom went to prison or went home with his new family. But would Jake tell the truth, or would he lie to get revenge on the man who had walked away from his gang? Jake Tolliver's chains rattled like snake bones as he shuffled forward. Every person in the courtroom leaned toward him, waiting to hear what he would say. Tom felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall into darkness or step into sunlight. "Thomas Garrett never robbed that bank," Jake said clearly. The words hit the room like thunder. People gasped. The prosecutor's mouth fell open like a fish. Tom couldn't breathe for a moment. Jake kept talking. "Tom left my gang 5 years ago. Haven't seen him since. He told me I was heading straight to hell, and he wouldn't follow me there." Eleanor's hand flew to her heart. Tears started rolling down her cheeks. Patrick put his arm around his mother's shoulders, standing proud like a soldier. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward in his big chair. "Are you saying you lied about Mr. Garrett being part of your gang?" Jake's face twisted with something that might have been shame. "I let people think he was still with us because—" He stopped and looked at Tom. "Because I was mad that he found a better way to live." The prosecutor jumped up. "Your Honor, this man is obviously trying to help his friend escape justice." "Friend?" Jake laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Tom Garrett stopped being my friend the night he called me a thief and a coward. Said I was stealing from families just trying to survive." The courtroom got quiet again. Even the babies stopped making noise. Jake looked at the Sullivan children lined up in the front row. His voice got softer. "That night, we had taken horses from a family with kids about their age." He pointed toward Molly and Sean. "Tom watched those little ones cry as we rode away with their animals. He threw down his share of the money and rode off into the dark." Michael was writing fast in his notebook, trying to capture every word. Bridget held Sean's hand tight. Little Molly hugged her doll and stared at Jake with big, serious eyes. "Why should we believe you now?" Judge Hawthorne asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because look at him. Look at what he's built." He gestured toward Tom and the Sullivan family. "That's not something a bank robber does. That's something a good man does." The marshal stepped forward. "There's more, Your Honor. Mr. Tolliver has agreed to help us find money his gang stole over the years. He says Mr. Garrett might know where some of it is hidden." Tom's stomach dropped like a stone. Even though Jake was telling the truth about the bank robbery, there was still the matter of Tom's past. The things he had done before, he changed his ways. Eleanor seemed to read his thoughts. She walked over to Tom and took his chained hands in hers. "Whatever you did before doesn't matter," she whispered. "I know who you are now." Tom felt tears sting his eyes. "Eleanor, there are things about my past." "That's between you and God," she said firmly. "And maybe between you and the people you wronged. But it's not between you and me." Judge Hawthorne banged his hammer. "In light of this new testimony, I'm dropping all charges against Thomas Garrett." The courtroom exploded with cheers. Patrick whooped like a cowboy. Michael threw his hat in the air. The little ones jumped up and down. Eleanor buried her face in Tom's shoulder as a deputy unlocked his chains. But the celebration stopped when the marshal cleared his throat. "Mr. Garrett, we'd still like to talk to you about helping us recover stolen money. There might be families out there who never got back what was taken from them." Tom looked at the Sullivan children. They had taught him what family meant. Now he had a chance to help other families get back what they had lost. "I'll help," Tom said without hesitation. "Whatever I can remember, wherever the money might be hidden, those families deserve to get their property back." Jake nodded with something like respect. "Always were too honest for your own good, Tom." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Tom replied. The marshal explained that recovering the stolen money would take time. Tom would need to travel to different places where the gang had hidden their loot. It might take months to find everything. Eleanor squeezed Tom's hand. "We'll wait," she said simply. "However long it takes." Patrick stepped forward, looking serious and grown up. "Mr. Garrett, we'll keep the ranch running until you get back. You taught me enough to handle things." "The horses will miss you," Sean said solemnly. "I'll write you letters every week," Michael promised, waving his notebook. Little Molly tugged on Tom's coat. "Will you come back and tell me more stories?" Tom knelt down to her level. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." As they left the courthouse, Tom felt different than when he had walked in. The chains were gone, but more than that, the weight of carrying his past alone was gone too. He had people who believed in him now, people who saw his heart instead of his mistakes. Jake was led away to serve his time in prison. Before he disappeared through the door, he called out, "Tom, take care of that family. They're worth more than all the gold we ever stole." Tom nodded. He already knew that. Outside, the spring air smelled like rain and new grass. The Sullivan family climbed into their wagon, making room for Tom between them. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm like an anchor. "Are you worried about the traveling you'll have to do?" she asked. Tom looked at the faces around him, Patrick driving the wagon with steady hands, Michael already planning his next letter, Bridget and Sean arguing about who got to sit next to the window at home. Little Molly curled up against his side, her doll clutched tight. "No," Tom said, understanding something important. "For the first time in my life, I know exactly where home is. No matter how far I travel, I'll always find my way back." As the wagon rolled through the dusty streets of Cheyenne, Tom realized that sometimes the hardest journey isn't finding where you belong. Sometimes it's believing you deserve to stay there. But with Eleanor's hand warm on his arm and 6 children who had chosen to call him family, Tom was ready to finish paying for his past so he could fully embrace his future. The road ahead might be long, but he wouldn't be traveling it alone anymore. A gunshot cracked through the morning air like thunder. Tom dove behind the hotel's wooden stairs as Marshal Davies shouted orders to his men. Jake Tolliver's gang hadn't given up after all 3 riders were charging down Cheyenne's main street, guns blazing, determined to silence their former leader before he could tell lawmen where more stolen money was hidden. Tom's heart pounded as he thought about Eleanor and the children inside the hotel. Were they safe? The breakfast they'd shared just an hour ago felt like a lifetime away. He'd been telling them about his choice whether to help find the reward money or walk away from his past forever. Now his past was shooting back at him. "Get down!" Tom yelled to Patrick, who was standing frozen by their wagon. The 16-year-old boy dropped behind the wooden wheels just as bullets splintered the hotel sign above his head. Eleanor appeared in the hotel doorway, her face white with fear. "The children!" she called out. "Stay inside!" Tom shouted back. He could see little Molly's scared face in the window. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of, his dangerous past, hurting the people he loved. Marshal Davies crawled over to Tom's hiding spot. "These boys won't stop until Jake's dead," he said, reloading his gun. "They know he's got information that could put them all in prison for life." Tom understood the terrible math. If Jake died, the truth about hidden money would die with him. Poor families who'd been robbed would never get their savings back. But if Tom helped catch these outlaws, he'd be diving headfirst into the very violence he'd tried to leave behind. "Mr. Garrett," Davies continued, "I know you want a peaceful life, but sometimes good men have to fight for peace." Another volley of gunshots rang out. Tom heard glass breaking. Someone had shot out the general store's front window. Innocent people were diving for cover all along the street. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, was crying behind an overturned cart. Old Mr. Wilson was trapped in his barber shop. Tom made his choice. He sprinted across the muddy street, using wooden barrels and hitching posts for cover. His goal was the sheriff's office where extra guns were stored. If he could arm more townspeople, they could surround the outlaws instead of just hiding from them. "Patrick," Tom called to Eleanor's oldest son, "can you handle a rifle?" The boy's eyes went wide, but he nodded. "Yes, sir. Papa taught me to hunt." Tom tossed Patrick a Winchester rifle from the sheriff's rack. "Just like hunting, son, except we're protecting instead of killing for food." The gunfight stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Tom found himself thinking not about the danger, but about the choice he'd been struggling with all morning. Here was his answer, written in smoke and gunpowder. Some paths led backward into old mistakes. Other paths led forward into new responsibilities. When the shooting finally stopped, 2 of the outlaws were dead, and the 3rd was wounded and captured. Tom had taken a bullet in his shoulder, nothing serious, but enough to remind him that choosing the right side didn't make you bulletproof. Eleanor rushed to him as soon as the street was safe. Her hands shook as she examined his wound. "You could have been killed," she whispered. "But I wasn't," Tom replied. "And now I know what I have to do about that reward money." Marshal Davies approached them, his hat dusty and his badge dented from where a bullet had grazed it. "Mr. Garrett, these men were carrying a map. Looks like Jake wasn't the only one who knew where the stolen money was hidden. They were planning to collect it all before Jake could talk." Tom studied the rough drawing on the piece of paper. He recognized several landmarks, places he'd ridden past during his 2 years with Jake's gang. Places where innocent people's life savings were buried like pirate treasure. "I know these spots," Tom said quietly. "All of them." Eleanor looked at him with those green eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "This isn't about money anymore, is it?" Tom shook his head. "It's about making things right. Really right. Not just legally right." Patrick stepped forward, still holding the rifle that had helped save the town. "We could come with you," he said. "The whole family. Make it an adventure instead of something you have to face alone." Michael appeared with his ever-present notebook, having documented the entire gunfight from the hotel window. "Think of the stories we could write about finding treasure and returning it to the rightful owners." Bridget was already organizing supplies with the practical efficiency that would serve her well as a woman. "We'll need food for several days of riding, and medical supplies in case there's more trouble." Little Molly tugged on Tom's good arm. "Papa Tom," she said, using the name that made his heart skip every time. "Will there be more bad men trying to hurt us?" Tom knelt down to her level, wincing slightly from his shoulder wound. "Maybe, sweetheart. But you know what I learned today?" "What?" "Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the bad men. It's being brave enough to do what's right, even when it's dangerous." Sean, who'd been quietly listening, spoke up with 8-year-old wisdom. "Like when Mama decided to fight the bank people instead of just giving up?" Eleanor smiled at her son's observation. "Exactly like that." As the family prepared for a journey that would take them across 3 territories to recover stolen money, Tom realized his compass had been pointing in the right direction all along. Not toward a destination, but toward a purpose. Not toward a place, but toward people who made any place feel like home. The reward money would come eventually, lawmen had promised that much. But the real treasure wasn't buried in remote canyons or hidden in abandoned mines. It was sitting around him in the form of 6 children who called him Papa, and 1 woman who'd taught him that love was just another word for choosing the same person's happiness over and over again. Marshal Davies approached with final instructions and a warning about the dangerous country they'd be traveling through. "Are you sure about taking the whole family?" he asked. Tom looked at Eleanor, who nodded firmly. He looked at Patrick, standing tall with new confidence. He looked at the younger children, eager for adventure and certain that their family could handle anything together. "Marshal," Tom said, "I've been running from my past for 5 years. Time I faced it head on, and I can't think of better company for the journey." 6 months later, the first snow of winter was dusting the mountains around their ranch when Tom heard horses approaching fast. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, but his tension melted when he saw the familiar blue uniform of Marshal Davies and the relieved faces of bank officials from 3 different territories. "Mr. Garrett," Davies called out as he dismounted, "we've got news you'll want to hear." Eleanor came out of the house, her hands flour-covered from baking bread. The children gathered around as they always did when visitors arrived, curious, protective, and united. Tom still marveled at how naturally they'd become a family unit that faced everything together. "The last of the stolen money has been returned," Davies announced with a grin. "Every penny accounted for and back to its rightful owners. Banks in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana territories have all confirmed their funds are restored." Mr. Peterson from the Denver bank stepped forward with an envelope thick enough to choke a horse. "This is your reward, Mr. Garrett. $15,000, as promised. More money than most families see in a lifetime." Tom stared at the envelope but didn't reach for it immediately. $15,000, enough to buy the finest ranch in the territory. Enough to ensure his children, and he thought of them as his children would never want for anything. "There's more," Davies continued. "The territorial governor wants to offer you a position as special investigator. Good pay, respect, a chance to use your knowledge of outlaw operations to help other families like yours." Eleanor's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but Tom heard it. They'd talked about this possibility during their long journey recovering the hidden money. A steady job with the territory would mean stability, respectability, a secure future. It would also mean months away from home, facing dangers that could leave 6 children fatherless again. "That's quite an offer," Tom said carefully. Little Molly, now 9 and fierce as her mother, stepped forward with the directness that always surprised adults. "Papa Tom, would you have to go away from us to do this job?" The bank official looked confused by the child's question, but Tom knelt down to Molly's level. "Sometimes, sweetheart, but I'd always come home." "Like when soldiers go to war?" Sean asked with the worry of a 10-year-old who'd already lost one father. Tom felt the weight of 6 pairs of eyes studying his face. These children had learned not to take promises lightly. They'd learned that men could disappear forever, leaving families to struggle alone. Patrick, now 17 and nearly as tall as Tom, spoke with surprising maturity. "Mr. Davies, what exactly would this job involve?" The marshal seemed impressed by the young man's directness. "Tracking down outlaw gangs. Mostly your father," he caught himself. "Mr. Garrett's knowledge of how these gangs operate could save a lot of innocent lives." Michael looked up from the notebook where he'd been recording every word of the conversation. How many innocent lives? Hard to say. Could be dozens. Could be hundreds over the years. Bridget, practical as always, asked the question everyone was thinking. How dangerous? Davies hesitated, and his pause was answer enough. Eleanor finally spoke. "Thomas, what does your heart tell you?" Tom stood slowly, feeling the familiar weight of choice. But this time was different. 5 years ago, choices had been about running from something. Now, they were about running toward something better. "My heart tells me," Tom said, "that I've spent enough years making up for the past. Maybe it's time to focus on building the future." He turned to Davies with a respectful but firm expression. "Marshal, I'm honored by the offer, but I've got a ranch to run and children to raise. Seems like that's adventure enough for any man." The bank officials exchanged glances, clearly surprised. Most men would jump at the chance for such prestigious work. "However," Tom continued, reaching for the reward envelope, "I do have a proposition." He opened the thick packet and counted out exactly half the money. "This goes to establishing a fund for families affected by outlaw activity. Widows, orphans, folks who've lost everything to gangs like Jake's." Eleanor's eyes went wide. "Thomas! And this half," he said, holding up the remaining money, "goes toward expanding our ranch. We're going to breed the finest horses in the territory and provide honest work for anyone willing to earn it." Davies grinned. "Including former outlaws looking for a second chance?" "Especially them," Tom replied. "Every man deserves the opportunity. I go to family willing to see who he could become instead of who he used to be." As the officials prepared to leave, Mr. Peterson pulled Tom aside. "Are you certain about this decision? That job offer won't stay open forever." Tom looked at the scene around him. Patrick was discussing horse breeding techniques with Davies. Michael was interviewing the bank officials for an article he planned to write. Bridget was organizing supplies for the visitor's journey home. Sean was showing off his reading skills to anyone who'd listen. Molly was telling elaborate stories to her collection of dolls. And Eleanor was watching it all with the contentment of a woman whose family was complete. "Mr. Peterson," Tom said, "I spent the first 35 years of my life searching for treasure. Turns out I was looking in all the wrong places." That evening, as snow continued to fall and the family gathered around their dinner table, Tom pulled out the old compass he'd carried for so many years. He'd retrieved it from the Cheyenne Hotel 6 months ago, thinking he might need it for their journey to recover the stolen money. "Why'd you keep that old thing?" Patrick asked. "You always know exactly where you're going now." Tom smiled, holding up the compass so the firelight reflected off its brass surface. "Because sometimes it's important to remember where you came from." He opened the back of the compass, revealing a tiny compartment he'd never mentioned to anyone. Inside was a small, faded photograph of a young couple, his parents, who died when he was 16 and left him alone in the world. "I've been carrying them with me all these years," Tom said quietly, "hoping to find a place where they'd be proud to see me settled." Eleanor reached over and took his hand. "Do you think this is it?" Tom looked around the table at faces that had become more familiar than his own reflection. Children who taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was choosing love despite the fear. A woman who'd shown him that the strongest families aren't born. They're built through daily choices to support each other. "I know it is," he said. Later that night, as Tom and Eleanor stood on their porch watching snow blanket their land, she asked the question that had been hanging between them all day. "Any regrets about turning down that job?" Tom pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair and the promise of their life together. "Eleanor Sullivan Garrett," he said, using the name she'd legally taken after their quiet wedding ceremony 3 months ago, "I've learned something important about treasure hunting." "What's that?" "The real treasure isn't something you find. It's something you build, day by day, choice by choice, with people who choose to build it alongside you." In the distance, a wolf howled its lonely song to the winter moon. Once, Tom had understood that loneliness. Now, surrounded by the gentle sounds of his family settling into evening routines, he understood something far more powerful. The peace that comes from being exactly where you belong, with exactly the people who need you as much as you need them. The lonely cowboy who'd come to buy a horse had discovered that some purchases can't be made with gold. They require the currency of courage, compassion, and the willingness to believe that everyone deserves a family, whether born into it or built through the brave choice to love without guarantees. And sometimes, if hearts are brave enough and faith is strong enough, that family becomes the greatest treasure of all.